Chapter 33 of the Tanya talks about the concept of joy and simcha, happiness, that a person has to get himself happy, especially from time to time. And in fact, it really requires that a person should be happy all the time. Just that the meditation to cause that happiness is something that the servant of God, the Beinoni, can have continuously, but requires strengthening from time to time by meditation. As an introduction to the story, I'll tell you briefly a story that happened to one of my favorite people in the whole world, and his name is Rav Mendel Futterfass of blessed memory. Rav Mendel was in a bitter jail. He had helped a couple of hundred Hasidim escape the Soviet Union, and he was arrested and convicted of crimes against the government, was given 10 years in Siberia. He was in bitter, bitter places that we could only imagine in our wildest nightmares. He had no opportunities to pray normally as we would. He had very little opportunity for kosher food, and certainly in the holiday of Passover he suffered greatly. And he persevered. And the reason he persevered was because of his tremendous faith and tremendous love and his joy for living. And this story is indicative of that joy. Among Rav Mendel's closest friends was a man by the name of Moshe Vyshensky, who lived in what was then eastern Poland, western Russia. And he was also arrested, not in 1946, but in 1948, a short while after his wife gave birth to twins, a boy and a girl. And he was arrested and sent to a bitter jail. But in the process, the jailers had forgotten that another Jew, a Hasidic Jew, who happened to be a friend of his, was in the very next cell to Rav Moshe. Rav Moshe was very despondent. From his part, he kept the Torah in the prison. He refused to work on Shabbat, on the Sabbath day, on the Sabbath. And even though they threatened to kill him, the guards had great respect for him. They saw this was a holy man who constantly said words of Torah and prayer throughout his entire incarceration. He was a person of great faith and happiness and strength and wisdom, remarkable person. Rav Moshe, however, was despondent. His wife had just given birth to twins, young children. Who knows how they could survive? He had 4 other children. I've been blessed to know 4 of the 6 children. The other 2 are women, I don't know them. But the boys I know, I was blessed to know all of them. And Rav Moshe was despondent over the inability that he had to be able to care for them, to care for their spiritual growth. They were growing up in the land where denial of God was the official policy of the government, and everything possible to uproot and eradicate any religion, especially the Jewish religion, was the official policy of the government. And so here he was, a bearded chassid with tremendous love for God and the pain of not being able to care for his family financially and spiritually weighed on him heavily. And at night, the nights were sleepless. He couldn't make peace with his situation. one night, at exactly 3 o'clock in the morning, he began to hear someone crying. People cry in jail. They cry for their mothers. They cry for their wives. They cry for their lovers. They cry for their children. They cry for any number of people. They cry. But this wasn't a crying of not having a relationship with someone. This was a different type of cry. And he recognized the cry. And he listened. And the cry was like someone praying. Someone in prayer crying that he wasn't able to reach God properly. That his focus was on the material world and he didn't have the proper focus on the spiritual world. And he cried and he heard this cry. And it attracted him. And he didn't know what it was coming from. How could a person cry like that in the middle of a Soviet jail? What he did not know was that on the other side of the wall was a venerable chassid, just as venerable, perhaps even more than he, who was able to, by guile, by charm, by pleading, by threatening, was able to get the jailer to agree that he bring in his talis and his tefillin. Only the Rashi's tefillin. The jailer would not allow Rabbeinu Tam's tefillin. Apparently he must have known about Yiddishkeit. He says, one pair is enough for you. And Rabendel never forgave him for that. And Rabendel was able to smuggle in his talis and his tefillin. But when could you pray? You couldn't pray normal hours. You'd have to work at those times. So Mendel made a calculation that the only time he could pray was when nobody was listening, when people were sleeping, the guards themselves were sleeping, and he would daven in talis and tefillin between 3 and 4 each day, except for Shabbos. And that's how he conducted his life through the almost 10 years in prison. And Rav Moshe, being in the next cell, was up at 3 a.m. and heard the cry. Rav Moshe was no slouch. He understood that there was something going on, and he found out that next to him was one of his oldest friends, Rav Mendel Futafas. Rav Mendel, on the other hand, already knew Rav Moshe was there. Rav Mendel was afraid that Rav Moshe would not be able to hold out the suffering, the psychological and physical suffering of the brutal jail. The jail was cold and dark. It was freezing. And the work was bitter and monotonous. There was no respite from it. And he was afraid that Rav Moshe would go into depression. And once a person was in a state of depression, most of them could not survive the year. 1 year, and 95% of those who were sent to those jails were dead. And the reason for it was not so much the physical as the mental, the psychological, the spiritual. Rav Mendel ventured to get Rav Moshe into his cell. And what did Mendel do? How could he bribe the guard to get Rav Moshe into his cell? He gave the guard half of his bread for a month. And by giving the guard half of his bread, the guard agreed that for 1 month, Rav Moshe would be in Rav Mendel's cell. But how did they greet each other the first time? And this is the story how they did. After Rav Moshe heard Rav Mendel davening, he had the guard contact Rav Mendel, and when they ascertained that they indeed knew each other and that it was safe, they agreed that one night at 2 a.m. they were going to speak to each other.